Hello, welcome back for our final day of talking about settings. So earlier this week, we talked about what a setting is and how to look for a setting. But today I want to talk to you about when the setting is really important. So today's lesson is called Settings Can Be Really Important. How do you know? Sometimes the author gives us a setting just so we can kind of picture it, but sometimes the setting is really important. So let me show you some of the clues that I look for when I'm trying to decide how important is the setting. So just a refresher, when we talk about the setting, we mean where is the story happening? When in time? Is it in the past? Is it in the future? And what's going on in the background? So keep those ideas in your mind when we're talking about setting. Here are some clues that the setting is really important in this story. The first one is if the story takes place in the past or the future. If the author decided to pick a historical time to set their story, or if the author is telling you about what they are envisioning for the future, the setting's probably really important. And you need to really think about what's going on in that time frame. So, for example, if you're reading, let's say, the I Survived books or some Ranger in Time books, later in the year we're going to read Esperanza Rising, which takes place in the past. If you're reading a book where the author gives you a date from the past, or the author tells you 30 years after the turn of the century, and you go, wait a second, this story is happening in 2030, the author picked that time because it's really important to the story. So be on the lookout for stories that are in the past or the future. The next thing that I always look for in the setting, and this is a where question, is if it happens in a specific city or country. If the author specifically tells you, let me fix that. If the author specifically tells you the name of the place where your story takes place, it's probably important. They're wanting you to see that it's in a different place. And so you need to really be on the lookout for why did the author set the story in a different country or in a really specific city. For example, if I was writing my personal narrative and I wanted my story to happen in Seattle, that would be a really different story than if I decided, let's say, to have my story set in New York City. If I have my story in Seattle, I might be showing like West Coast things, things that we're familiar with. But if I set my story in New York City, that's a really big city. I want people to know it's in a different place. So be on the lookout for a specific city or country. The third one I look for is if the setting is extreme or surprising. This is one that Hatchet really falls into. Gary Paulson spends a lot of time showing us how extreme Brian's setting is, whether it's the animals that walk through and injure him, whether it's the mosquitoes that attack him, or it's events that are coming that I won't spoil for you. So if the setting is really like shocking or unusual, the author picked that for a reason. Gary Paulson didn't have Brian land lightly in a little meadow with lots of fruit trees. He wanted him to be somewhere extreme so that we could see Brian grow in his survival skills. And then the last one is if the setting features a specific culture or cultures. So if there are lots of clues in the background that there are specific cultural things, then that's important to your setting. For example, when we read Islandborn about Lola, who was trying to remember the island, all around her she saw clues about the culture on the island of the Dominican Republic. So there were things like when she went into the stores and people had pictures up from the island, there were flowers, there were people in the background selling mangoes or other foods, like I think they had empanadas and stuff like that. So if there were things in the background to make us kind of get that island from the Dominican Republic feeling, the author wanted those on purpose so that you could see how important the island was to the people around them. So if you'll notice, as I'm describing all of these really important places, I keep tying them back to why they're important. Authors make setting choices because they affect the whole story, which brings me to my next idea. When you find important setting stuff, you need to first of all visualize it. Stop and picture it. What does that look like? Can I see that in my mind? If it's really hard, maybe sometimes you need to stop and sketch it out. And then ask yourself, I'm going to write the letter P, how does this affect the plot? Does the setting have an important part in the story? In my class, we just got done reading about when the porcupine snuck in and stabbed Brian when it scared Brian. That setting, that spookiness of the wind in the trees and that yucky, creepy smell of the porcupine and all of the darkness where he couldn't see anything, all of that affected the plot. It got us to feel really scared along with Brian so that the porcupine would be even more intense. Also ask yourself, how does it affect the characters? Certain times the setting lets you see or learn things about the characters. When we see Brian build his shelter in that setting, we learn, hey, Brian's pretty clever. He didn't just sit underneath that rock overhang. He brought in sticks to make it better. That setting let me see how clever Brian is. And then the last one is the A for author. What is the author really trying to get me to see? So anytime I've got setting clues, I'm always thinking these three things. How does this affect the plot? What is this helping me see about the characters? And really, what is the author trying to show me? These are the things that you need to be on the lookout for when you run into setting clues. As you're reading the story, think about places where you should look for setting. We talked about that earlier this week, where you should be looking in the exposition in the beginning. Look whenever you've got a new section or chapter, if the author spends a lot of time describing, or if the character moves to a new place. And when you notice those new setting clues, take a second, visualize it, and then ask yourself, P, how does this affect the plot? C, what does this show about characters? And A, what is the author trying to show me? All right, on the next slide, I've got some questions for you. See how many of them you can answer.